Hi, class. Dr. Searcy here with the PSYC B1B lecture for Chapter 3. As you can see, the title of the chapter is Anatomy and Research Methods. We'll go and start the lecture with this part about the anatomy, specifically thinking about the anatomy of the nervous system. This is something that we would talk about more or less for the first couple of chapters, but here we can say that the nervous system is basically made up of two separate systems, where the first is the central nervous system, or the CNS. We would say that it is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and its function is to control the body / the mind. If you think about how we've been talking about, like, say, the reflex arc from the last chapter, right? We think about how the reflex arc is this network of neurons where you've got that neuron on the skin that is communicating with the interneuron inside the spinal cord. It could send messages up to the brain, but the interneuron can also send messages back to the motors, the muscles, right? Therefore causing messages to come across more quickly and efficiently. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the central nervous system and it controlling the body / the mind. However, in addition to the CNS, there also is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. Here, we'd say that this is what connects the CNS to the rest of the body, right? So the other parts of the nervous system. This consists of two subparts, where the first is the somatic nervous system, and it is made up of axons carrying messages throughout the body. Those messages are supposed to control the voluntary muscles, right? So those axons are carrying messages to parts of your body, like your arms, your legs, your fingers, your toes, and it's commanding them to move. So then the other subpart, right, of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. And this is made up of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Basically, these are to control the involuntary muscles, like the beating of the heart or the intestines. And we'd also note that the role that the sympathetic system has is to energize these parts of the body, right? To activate them, to cause them to kick into action. And the parasympathetic part is there to stop the activity that's occurring. Okay, so from there, let's talk about the structure of the vertebrate nervous system, right? So anytime we're talking about the anatomy of the body, right, we're pointing out different parts of the body, we want to talk about maybe a specific part. We often want to talk about that part with regard to, like, its location in the body. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, is how we identify different locations in the body. We're going to go over a list of terms, and we'll see where those terms are in terms of their locations of the body. The first set of terms that we're going to go over are ventral and dorsal, right? So if I'm talking about a part of the body and I'm saying that it's the ventral part of the body, I'm saying that I'm talking about the part of the body that is pointing towards the stomach. The opposite of that is the dorsal part of the body. If I refer to the dorsal part of the body, then I'm talking about some part of the body in the rear or the back of the body. Now, to help us understand this, I've got an illustration of a man here. And I just want to draw some directions for us, right, in terms of what parts of the body are we talking about. So we've just said that we have identified the ventral and the dorsal area. We could say that this part here is like the ventral part of the body, right? It's the part that's to the stomach. Whereas this other part back here, that would be the dorsal part because it's to the back. So then thinking about other terms that we would use to identify different locations of the body, another pair of terms that we talk about are the anterior versus the posterior parts of the body. Right, so the anterior is the part of the body that is in the front of the body, and the posterior is the part that's to the rear. We basically, for the human body, can think of these as being similar to ventral and dorsal, right? So the front of the body is this part here. So we could also think of it as the anterior part of the body as well. We've already identified this back part as being to the rear. And so it also could be the part that is posterior, right? The posterior part of the body. From there, another pair of terms that we can think about are the superior part of the body versus the inferior part of the body. Right, so if something is superior, it's saying that it's the above part, whereas if something is inferior, it's below something. So in a way, we could say that the head is superior to the feet because the head is above the feet. Conversely, the feet are inferior to the head because the feet are below the head. So maybe just to help us understand that, anything that's moving up can be thought of as superior, right? As long as it's above something else. And anything that is towards the bottom of the body, or the bottom of the body, would say that that's the inferior region of the body, as long as it's below something. Another pair of parts that we could talk about are the proximal area of the body versus the distal part, where the proximal is to the point of origin and the distal would be away from the point of origin. In this case, what is the point of origin of the body? We could say it's like the core of the body, right? The central region of the body. So anything that's proximal would be anything that's closer to the core of the body. Let's say that's like moving in the proximal direction there. If we're moving towards the core, then we're moving proximally. However, if we're moving away from the core, then we're saying that we are moving in a distal direction. Last pair of terms that we can think about are lateral versus medial. Whenever we talk about something being lateral to the body, we mean that it's to the side of the body. And medial would be to the middle of the body, right? So for instance, if I were to, say, shoot an arrow at this individual and the arrow went past the individual, right, went next to his arm, that would be lateral. However, if I shot an arrow into the man and the arrow went into the middle of the chest, then I would have shot my arrow into the medial section of the body. Okay. One thing that you might be thinking about is, well, why do they have two names for this ventral, this front region where they call it ventral and anterior. And why do they have two names for this dorsal, this posterior region, where that's the back part? Well, one way that you want to, one reason why is because you want to think about trying to identify a location on a body of a bipedal person or a bipedal individual. By bipedal, we mean a person that walks on 2 feet versus a quadrupedal person, right? A individual. A quadrupedal individual would be an individual that walks on all fours or 4 feet. So let's think about that for a second. Let's just think about, okay, draw an animal that would walk on all fours, like maybe a dog. Right, let me see if I can draw a dog here. Got the dog's head, little snout, little neck there. Maybe draw a little ear, little colored in nose. And then there's this part of the body, got a leg there, maybe a leg there, this part of the body, another leg. It's kind of a big leg compared to the rest of the body. Got his behind, and then maybe a tail. Okay, right, so if we were to think about the direction of the body with regard to the quadruped, right, the four-legged individual or the animal, then we would think about this front region and this back region as being different from what's to the stomach and what's to the back. So, for instance, here, what's the front of the dog? The front of the dog is this area here, and what's the back of the dog? The back is that area there. So we could say that this is the anterior region, and this is the posterior region. But whereas here the anterior and the posterior match up with the ventral and the dorsal, with the four-legged individual, the four-legged organism, ventral and dorsal are going to now be different. Ventral, right, that part that's pointing to the stomach would be the bottom of the dog because it's pointing to that area. And so then the dorsal region would be that part of the dog because it's pointing to the back of the dog, right? And so that's why there's these four terms for this front and this back part. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say about the anatomy. Actually, I want to do one last thing. I know I'm probably not supposed to do this, but I think dogs look so cute when they wear eyeglasses. I just want to draw some eyeglasses on there. Okay. So now, let's go ahead and move on to the next section that we've got for this lecture. And that is where I'm now going to talk about a little bit more of the anatomy of the body. And here, we're going to talk about the spinal cord. All right, and we've been talking about how the spinal cord is this region here. We've been talking about how it's part of the body that's built for communication, right? It houses all these nerve endings, and it allows messages to be sent from different parts of the body to the brain and back to the body. A question that we might ask ourselves is, well, how does that happen? And it's kind of an interesting story about how it happens. As it turns out, the spinal cord is made up of two different areas. There is what's referred to as the gray matter and the white matter, where the gray matter is the medial section of the spinal cord, and the white matter is the surrounding section, right? So here we've got like a little horizontal view of a chunk of spinal cord. We're looking at it from above, right? And we're seeing that in the middle, right, in that medial section, this little part right here is where the gray matter is. And so then that outer portion, that surrounding area, is where the white matter is. One thing that's kind of interesting is to see that the two areas contain different parts of neurons, right? So remember, the neuron that microscopic organism that we've been talking about, I think, since chapter 1. But we said that it consisted of like the dendrites, the cell body, the axon, the terminal buttons. The way that communication happens is you have a signal that comes into the dendrites, and then if the neuron itself wants to communicate, it's going to send a signal out through the terminal buttons. What we're seeing with regard to the spinal cord is that the spinal cord contains different parts of neurons in different parts of the different matters, right? So for instance, for the gray matter, it is filled with cell bodies and dendrites. It's filled with this part of the neuron. The white matter contains the axon, right? And if the axon's there, then it's going to also contain the terminal buttons. So one thing that's interesting to see is that it looks like, as far as communication is concerned, the gray matter is responsible for detecting signals or receiving information, and the white matter is responsible for sending out some signals or communicating with other neurons. When I think about this, one other thing that I kind of think about is, I guess, a metaphor of how this works in our lives, right? So think of, here we're talking about the spinal cord and the different chunks of the spinal cord. I guess I see this as akin to like the Highway 99 that goes from, well, all over California, but specifically around here, right, like Bakersfield to McFarland and then to Delano. It seems like the freeway itself, right, with the trucks and the cars traveling on it, that would be the white matter. But then the little towns on the route, right, so the McFarlands, the Delanos, the Tullares, each one of those towns would be a little spot of gray matter, right, where you're going to go into the town, you're going to communicate with different people, and then once you've communicated with those different people, you're going to get back on the freeway and you're going to go somewhere else, right, and then you're going to communicate with someone else in a different town, right? So it's just kind of interesting to kind of think about how that metaphor works for what we're talking about as far as how the spinal cord communicates. But beyond that, let's say that now we're done talking about this first part of the chapter. We're done talking about the anatomy, and now I just want to talk about research methods for a moment. As far as research methods are concerned, we want to talk about how studying the brain occurs, right? How is it done? I'm going to talk about several different ways that it's done, but to begin with, we can talk about research where researchers are trying to measure this interaction between the body and the brain, right? Kind of like we've been talking about that mind-body problem. Are the mind and the brain the same thing? Here, we're looking to see how much they are the same thing and how much they are different from each other. Got two different ways that we can talk about doing that. A first way that we can talk about doing this is through a psychophysiological assessment. I do want to break this word down for you guys to make sure that we understand what's meant by this term, psychophysiological. It basically consists of two parts. There's the psycho part, and then there's the physiological part. In the realm of psychology, anytime you see that prefix psycho, it's basically where someone is talking about something having to do with the mind. So then the other part, physiological, is a term that's used to refer to any body process, right? So how any process in the body works, right? For instance, physiological would refer to things like how does blood travel through the veins? How does it circulate throughout the body, go through the brain, go through the heart, those kinds of things, right? That would be a physiological assessment. So, when a researcher does a psychophysiological assessment. The kind of research that they're doing is where they're looking at how the body and the brain interact with each other, right? So the body would be the physiological part, the brain would be the psycho part. One way that this analysis could be done, right, we'll say an example would be the type of assessment that you see happening in this picture, a assessment called a polygraph. Also commonly known as the lie detector test, right? And in this assessment, you take some individual, you strap them to a bunch of different types of electrodes or like measurement devices, right? So this person might be hooked up to a heart measure, right? Some type of measure that's going to measure the beating of the heart. May also be hooked up to some other measure that looks at temperature, or whether there's any involuntary movements like the twitching of a finger or something like that. And what they're looking at is as they're measuring these different body processes, they're also asking the individual a series of questions. What's your name? Where were you last night? Those kinds of things. And the idea is that when the person is answering the questions, if the answers are truthful, then the process of the body is going to be natural, right? There's not going to be any weird changes in how the heart rate is or whether the person is sweating or not. If they start to lie, though, then there are detectable changes that do occur. Heart rate goes up, person starts to perspire, they might start to engage in more involuntary movements. This assessment is used to track that, right? So the person is being asked a question like, what's your name? There's a reading of the heart rate that's going to go along with their answer. Then they're asked the other question, where were you last night? If the person lies to that question, the researcher can detect the lie because there's going to be some change in some physiological measurement. By the way, the reason why it's called the polygraph is because the graph part is referring to the idea that we're measuring something, and poly refers to many. So what's happening here is the researcher, whoever is conducting the analysis, is measuring many different body processes, hence the term polygraph. Okay, but then another way that this type of measurement can be done is to do a electrophysiological measurement. And here, basically the same idea, except this time, when we look at measuring the body processes, we're looking to see how they are related to different electrical activity that might occur with regard to the body. One way that this is done, right, we'll just put an example here, is to use a measuring device that is depicted here. It's a thing called a encephalogram, or an EEG for short. The way that this device works is it's kind of like a crown that a person will wear on their head. But that crown consists of different kinds of electrodes or different kinds of measuring devices that are listening for electrical activity, right? And they're looking to see when there's a lot of electrical activity versus when there's a little bit of electrical activity. And then they're also looking to see, okay, well, if there is a little bit of electrical activity, what is the person doing? What activity are they engaged in while they have that low amount of electrical activity? Versus if there is a high amount of electrical activity, what else is the person doing? One big area of research where these types of studies are conducted is in the area of sleep research. A big reason why is because it's thought that as a person sleeps throughout the night, they pass through different stages of sleep where there are different levels of electrical activity occurring. And it's also thought that where there are the different levels of electrical activity, there also may be different types of dreams that may be occurring as well. I think we might talk about that a little bit more in this class, and so I'm going to save that for later. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and go back to talking about measuring the brain. I'm going to step away now from taking a look at measuring body-brain activity, and instead, I'm going to focus in on talking about specific brain imaging techniques that researchers can use. First question that we want to answer is, well, if a person is going to create an image of the brain, what is it that they're measuring? I think that the measuring is brain activity in different areas of the brain. For instance, let me ask you to think about this question for a second. Imagine yourself reading a book, right? Maybe it's your favorite Harry Potter novel or some other book that you're interested in reading, right? And you're engaged in the story, you're imagining the scene as you are reading the words. Now think of engaging in a completely different mental activity. Instead of reading a book where you're enjoying a novel or a story, think about working on a math problem. Now, maybe you are working with double digits, you're doing some adding, maybe it's some kind of algebra problem where there's adding and subtracting, and there's multiple steps that you have to engage in. A question that you might ask yourself is, as you are engaged in these two different activities, right, reading a book versus solving a math problem, are you using the same or different areas of the brain when you're engaged in these different activities? We would say that we would use brain imaging techniques to answer that type of question. And we're going to go over 3 specific types of brain imaging techniques that we can use to answer these types of questions. First type of technique that you can use is referred to as a PET scan. I'm going to go ahead and give you the full name before I describe it. The full name for the PET scan is it's the positron emission tomography scan, right? Positron emission tomography. And basically what this technique does is someone has some radioactive dye injected into their blood system. That radioactive dye is going to circulate throughout the person's body, right, including going into their brain. And we are going to have a device that we can use to track where that blood or that radioactive dye flows. The idea here is that we're tracking where that dye goes because it's thought that wherever the dye goes is part of the blood circulating through the body. And when you have a part of the brain that is more active, you're going to have more blood flow to that area. So if there's more radioactive dye flowing to that area, it's thought that it's flowing there because it's part of this process where more blood is flowing to that area in general, right? So thinking back to that question, am I using the same part of the brain to read a book as I am to answer a math problem? You can answer that question using this technique, right? So inject the dye into someone, have them do the reading, maybe for 10, 15 minutes, see if that dye goes to a certain region of the brain, then later have that same person solve a math problem and see if that dye goes to the same region of the brain or now a different region of the brain, right? So that's how we would use something like a PET scan. Another technique that we can use, though, is the MRI. The idea here is that the PET scan was one of the initial ways to do this brain imaging technique. A lot of people didn't want to do it though because they didn't like the idea of having some radioactive fluid injected into them. And so they wanted to see if there was a safer way that they could do it. Safer way that they came up with was the MRI. And basically MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. Here, the idea is that a person is placed on a bed where it's going to be slid into a little circular area. And in that little circular area, there's this big machine that is creating a magnetic field, right? Where energy is just circulating around this individual and it's creating like this aura around the person. The idea is that they shut that energy down all of a sudden, and when they do, it creates this image of what was going on in the brain in that moment when they shut everything down. And in that way, right, we create this detailed image of where there's activity that's occurring. We're answering that question again. If I'm doing something, what part of the brain is active? Okay, so again, wasn't thought of as the most healthy way to conduct these kinds of studies. Having this magnets around you, that kind of stuff. Is there an easier way to do it? Is there a safer way to do it? Is there a way where we could get a better image? And that technique was developed. The technique that came about was the fMRI. And basically what an fMRI is taking the same idea of the magnetic resonance imaging technique and just updating a little bit. One way that they're doing it is by now they're calling it the functional magnetic resonance imaging. Basically what happens here is instead of having this magnetic field created around someone, we're just using this ability where we can follow the oxygen that's in the blood, right? And follow it as it flows through the body. Same idea if some blood is flowing to a certain region in the brain, it's thought that it's flowing there because that part of the brain is most active. If there is blood in that region, what's one that we could track that blood is there? We can track it by the oxygen that's in that blood. Okay, so those are the different ways of studying the brain that I wanted to talk about. From here, I now want to go back to talk about the anatomy of the human brain. And I want to just kind of point out a bunch of different parts that we'll be talking about in the brain throughout the semester, right? So this is like a major introduction to the major anatomy of the brain, the major big parts of the brain that are going to be important to think about throughout the semester. One way that I wanted to introduce them to you, though, is I kind of want to follow on from a statement that I made in the chapter 2 notes. I'm sorry, I think it was the chapter 1 notes when I was talking about the definition of biological psychology. The thing that I said when I was talking about the definition of biological psychology, right, and this was chapter 1, I talked about how the human brain is a product of evolution, right? And the thing that I said was that the brain that we have today is not necessarily the same brain that the first humans had or that our ancestors had. So here I want to describe how that is the case, or how we think that is the case. And so I'm going to go over the evolution of the brain in terms of 3 major stages of evolution, beginning with maybe the earliest stage of evolution, the old brain. And we can describe the old brain as really just consisting of parts that regulated basic survival functions. That's all this brain did, right? Regulating things like your ability to eat, right? So it regulated your appetite, digestion, but regulated other things like your sleep cycle, right? Those kinds of. Okay, so if that's the case, the thing that we want to talk about is, well, what parts of the brain were present during that time? What did this brain look like? And so I have an image here with a bunch of different parts that we think were on this old brain. But remember what I said back in chapter 1 when I talked about this. I said that the way this brain looked was not really the way that the brain looks today. Instead, really, we think that the brain just consisted of these parts here. I got a pen for this, and I'm discovering this pen is dry. So I'm gonna try outlining this part this way. We'll say the old brain, we think, consisted of this, and the cerebellum, right? So these major regions. And all this other stuff, this stuff that we refer to today as the cerebral cortex, that was not there yet. None of this stuff existed. Okay, so if the old brain just consisted of what I'm outlining here, then what was on that? What was part of that? Well, here you're seeing that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different parts that were on this. And we can say that I guess the main part was the brainstem, right? The biggest chunk that you're seeing here. The brainstem was this little area here. Here I'm saying that it was the most ancient and central core of the brain. It's what housed all these other parts, right? So then what were the other parts? Well, one other part was this thing called the thalamus, right? And it's often referred to as the sensory gateway because its function is to take in sensory information, things like seeing, hearing, touching, and tasting. Note that 4 of the 5 senses here, the sense that's not here is smell, right? So smell followed a different pathway. But in addition to the thalamus, there also was the medulla and the pons. Both of these parts were basically responsible for regulating those autonomic functions that we talked about earlier, right? So remember when we talked about earlier in this chapter, the autonomic nervous system, we said that it was made up of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and it controlled the involuntary muscles. That's what we think these 2 parts of the brain did way back when and still do today, right? The pons and the medulla. So in addition to that, we also have the reticular formation. Basically, the reticular formation is responsible for like your sense of arousal. By arousal, I mean your activity level, right? So say when you're active during the day, if you are aware of others around you or what's going on in your environment, that awareness is due to your reticular formation. So then another part that we think that was present during this old brain phase was the cerebellum, right? This like baseball-sized ball of tissue at the posterior end of the brainstem, right? Remember, posterior was to the back. And it looks like the cerebellum actually was responsible for several functions. It looks like it's involved in nonverbal learning, right? So learning that doesn't require language, perception of time, which is kind of interesting. So if you think about now versus earlier, right? The cerebellum is helping you process that. And it also we think that it's evolved a little bit in emotion as well. Now, one thing that's interesting about this, right, is that we're thinking that this part of the brain has been around for about 500 million years. Humans haven't been around that long, nearly that long. So this was something that was present in the ancestors to the humans. When I say 500 million years, really we think that the only organisms that existed were the fish that lived in the ocean. One thing that started to happen, we think that is about 250 million years ago, right? So we're saying 500 million years when the brainstem emerges, just fish in the ocean have it. Move forward about 250 million years, fish are starting to emerge out of the ocean, right? They're becoming land-based animals. You have amphibians that live in both the ocean, or in the water and the land. But then you've got the development of the reptiles, the dinosaurs, those kinds of things. We think that they were around 250 million years ago. So it looks like the old brain, this structure here, was developing anywhere from 500 million to 250 million years ago. But then the next stage in our evolutionary history is the development of the limbic system. We think that this system started to develop about 150 million years ago. And its purpose is to regulate your emotions, your social bonding, right? So bonding, say, or your emotional regulation. And so the bonding with strangers, bonding with your family members, even bonding with animals that are like pets, those kinds of things. And what we think is happening here is that the brainstem, the cerebellum, these areas are further developing. And so you have these structures on this area that are further developing. Namely, these three parts here. The hypothalamus, which we think of as like the headquarters or like a hormone headquarters, which helps regulate different activities of the body. For instance, our body temperature, our circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm is, circadian means like about a day. So this helps to regulate any cycle that we engage in that takes about a day or so to complete, right? So like your sleep-wake cycle. It also regulates your hunger. And the way all these things are regulated, right, by the hypothalamus is that the hypothalamus will create hormones that act as like messengers or commands for the body to manufacture other things or to engage in other processes. So then a second part that developed during this time is the amygdala. The amygdala is thought to be your emotion control or your emotion processing center, where anytime you experience some type of an encounter with someone or something and you have an emotional reaction to it, that emotional reaction is occurring in your amygdala. It's thought to specifically like control or process like your extreme emotions like fear or aggression, anger, those kinds of things. Think about those emotions that really control your behavior. I think I may have talked about in a previous chapter how, at least for me, fear is the thing that really controls the things that I do or causes me to jump into action when the other emotions don't. Okay. So then a third structure that developed when the limbic system emerged was the hippocampus. And it's thought that the hippocampus is involved in learning and memory, specifically like the creation of newer memories. For instance, if the hippocampus is damaged, you could lose your ability to retain new facts / memories. Okay, so from there we can talk about this then last stage of our evolution, the development of the cerebral cortex, where the cerebral cortex is all of that surrounding tissue, so all of this area here. Today, we think that we can separate different regions of that cerebral cortex according to 4 different areas or 4 different lobes. And the way that we can separate those different regions is because it looks like each of those regions is responsible for a separate or a different function. And I want to go over what those different functions are. First, I want to note that each of these 4 sections has a name. And I put the names here, right? So we've got a section here in blue. That's the frontal lobe. This section here in yellow is the parietal lobe. Section in green is the temporal lobe. And the section in pink is the occipital lobe. And so let's just talk about what each of those lobes is thought to do. It's thought that the occipital lobe is involved in your ability to see. It's where vision is processed. Again, how do we know this kind of thing? And one way that we know this kind of thing is we see that if this part of the brain gets damaged, then it basically causes the person to lose their ability to see. By the way, I thought there was a really interesting part in the book where they talked about this and damage. And they said that think about a person who is blind. The person who has this part damaged can't even imagine seeing something, right? Can't even create an image in their brain of seeing something. It's kind of interesting, kind of fascinating to me about that. Anyway, so a second region of the brain is also the parietal lobe. This region is involved in your sense of touch and body position, right? So where your body is relative to other things in your environment. A third region, this bottom part right here, is the temporal region, and it's thought that it processes hearing, right? So anytime you hear something, it processes what you've heard in terms of sounds that you've heard and speech, right? So making meaning of different speech sounds that you've come across. So then the fourth and the last region is the frontal region. It's thought that this might be the most evolved region, the most recently evolved region. And it's also thought that this is where the higher level of functioning happens that really separates us from the rest of the members of the animal kingdom. This is where things like speaking, planning, judging, abstract thinking, and personality occur. Okay, so that's everything that I've got for this lecture, for this chapter. Thank you very much.